The morning light crept slowly across the wooden floor, touching the corners of Helen's small living room. Dust floated lazily in the air, catching the sunlight like tiny stars. The house was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but hollow quiet. The kind that reminded her she was the only one left to hear the ticking clock. She sat in her chair by the window, her hands folded neatly, watching the world move without her. Outside, the street stirred with life. Children laughing, dogs barking, doors opening and closing. She heard it all faintly through the glass, a symphony of belonging from which she felt excluded. Inside, only the slow hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. Her husband's old chair sat opposite hers, empty for years, but still turned toward her as if waiting. She sometimes imagined he might still be sitting there, invisible, just listening. The mornings were the hardest. She would wake too early, forgetting for a heartbeat that she was alone. Then the truth would settle like fog, soft, heavy, unavoidable. "Good morning," she whispered, not to herself, but to the echo of a presence she once knew. Her voice filled the air and faded quickly, leaving behind only the sound of her breath. Helen moved through the house slowly, touching the furniture as she passed, the way one might greet old friends. "Still here," she said to no one in particular. The words weren't sad, they were simply true. She brewed her tea, set out a single cup, and sat in silence, her eyes lingering on the second cup she never used anymore. When the clock struck 9, she whispered, "Another day, Lord." The words weren't a complaint or a prayer, just a surrender. The quiet didn't answer, but she had grown used to that. Still, somewhere deep in her chest, faith flickered, small, trembling, but alive. Later that morning, Helen opened the drawer beside her chair and pulled out a small box. Inside were photographs, worn, faded, but precious. Her husband's face smiled up at her from every angle, in youth, in laughter, in love. She ran her finger over one picture, tracing the outline of his jaw. "You'd tell me not to cry," she whispered, "but you always knew I would." The house had felt too big since the day he left it. Not in space, but in memory. Each room still held the ghost of their conversations, the sound of their steps, the warmth of their ordinary days. Sometimes at night she would reach across the bed and almost expect his hand to be there. It never was, but she still reached anyway. Habit and hope often looked the same. She placed the photograph on the table beside her and stared at it for a long time. "Do you see me?" she asked softly. "Do you know I'm still waiting?" The question wasn't one of despair. It was the ache of love that refused to forget. The silence of the room seemed to hold its breath. In the afternoons, she would hum the hymn they used to sing together. "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide." The words lingered in the air like a prayer half-remembered. "That's all I want," she whispered, "for him to abide." And when the evening shadows stretched across the walls, she sat still, eyes on the photograph, heart caught between memory and eternity. "You're not really gone," she murmured, closing the box gently. "You just went ahead." One evening, as the rain tapped gently against the windows, Helen noticed that the old clock on the mantel had stopped. Its pendulum hung still, frozen mid-swing. She rose slowly and tapped the glass, but it didn't stir. "I suppose we all stop moving eventually," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. She didn't mean it as sadness, just truth spoken aloud. The quiet tick that once filled her house had always comforted her. It had been the rhythm of life, steady, dependable like her husband's breathing at night. Now the silence felt different, deeper. Without the clock's heartbeat, time itself seemed to fade. The hours melted together like candle wax. She sat back down, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe you stopped it," she said, glancing toward the ceiling. "Maybe you're reminding me that time isn't what matters." The thought comforted her in a strange way. The world outside was rushing, but she was still caught between the now and the not yet. That night she fell asleep in her chair, the rain still whispering at the window. She dreamed of the sea, vast, endless, calm. Her husband stood at the shore, smiling, calling her name. She woke before she could answer, tears on her face, but peace in her chest. "Not yet," she whispered, but someday. The clock remained still, but she didn't mind anymore. It wasn't measuring loss now. It was keeping time for eternity. Days passed, then weeks. The phone on the wall stayed quiet, its cord curling like a forgotten promise. Helen's children had called months ago, promising to visit when things slow down. She understood. Life moves fast for those still running. But for her, time had slowed to a patient ache. She no longer waited by the window, though she still glanced toward it sometimes, just in case. Each morning, she set out 2 plates for breakfast, an old habit she couldn't break. When the second stayed empty, she smiled gently and said, "Maybe tomorrow." The words weren't bitter. They were hope, spoken softly enough to sound like faith. On Sundays, she dressed in her best coat and went to church alone. People greeted her kindly, but their smiles faded quickly into busyness. She sat near the back, where the light from the stained glass painted her face in color. When the hymns began, her voice trembled, thin but true. After the service, she'd linger, hoping for conversation. Sometimes she got a few kind words. "Lovely to see you, Helen. You're still glowing." But then they left, and she returned home to her quiet kitchen, her empty chair, her cup of tea growing cold. That night, as she washed her cup, she whispered, "I suppose it's just you and me again." Her voice didn't sound lonely. It sounded expectant. Somewhere deep in her chest, something small stirred, a whisper she couldn't name, but felt. The photograph hung crooked on the wall, framed in dust and sunlight. Helen straightened it every morning, not because it bothered her, but because it made her feel needed. Her husband's eyes smiled back at her from another lifetime, strong, kind, and steady. "You'd hate how quiet it's gotten," she said softly, touching the glass. "You always filled the silence with humming." She spent her days talking to him, not as memory, but as habit. "Do you remember that winter?" she'd say while folding laundry. "You burned the toast every morning." Her laughter was soft and short-lived, swallowed quickly by the hush of the house, but even that brief sound made the room warmer. Sometimes when the afternoon light hit the photograph just right, she imagined he blinked just once, as if to remind her he was closer than she thought. "I like to think heaven lets you visit," she whispered one day. "Not to change anything, just to sit with me a while." That evening, she set his chair at the table again, the way it had always been. "Dinner for 2, she said with a faint smile. "Just like old times." She bowed her head, praying not for food or health, but for presence, that sacred, quiet comfort that fills empty rooms with meaning. As she ate, she felt it, faint, steady warmth spreading through her chest. Not a vision, not a sound, just peace, the kind that doesn't explain itself. She looked at the photograph and smiled. "Maybe you sit here too," she said. "Both of you." The night before bed, Helen knelt beside her chair. The floorboards were cold against her knees, her body weak, but her soul steady. "Lord," she whispered, "you know I don't ask for much. Just stay with me a while." Her words were few, but they carried the weight of every night spent waiting for footsteps that never came. She prayed for her children, for their joy, their safety, their peace. She prayed for strangers she'd never meet, for mothers, for widows, for anyone who knew what loneliness felt like. And then, when her voice grew faint, she prayed for herself, not to be remembered, but not to be forgotten by heaven. Her Bible lay open on the table beside her. The candlelight flickered across the pages, making the words seem alive. She read slowly, "I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you." She paused, tears filling her eyes. "You said that," she whispered. "You said you'd come." Silence answered her, soft but deep. The wind outside brushed the windows like a hand tracing glass. "Is that you?" she asked gently. "Or am I just hearing what I hope for?" The question didn't carry doubt, only longing. She stayed there on her knees until the candle burned low, her shadow swaying gently against the wall. When she finally rose, she whispered, "If I can't hear you, teach me to feel you." And as she lay down, something unseen settled over her. Not words, not vision, just warmth. The next morning came without sound. No birdsong, no wind, no movement outside. Helen woke to a silence so thick it felt alive. She sat up slowly, unsure if she was comforted or afraid. "You're quiet today," she murmured. "But then again, so am I." She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and sat by the window, the stillness pressing close. She used to fear silence. It reminded her of loss, of absence. But now it seemed different and not empty but waiting, the kind of silence that felt like breath before a word. She closed her eyes and let it fill her, not fighting it, not naming it. "You're here, aren't you?" she whispered. "Just quiet." Her thoughts drifted to Jesus sitting in lonely places to pray. "Maybe you understand," she said softly. "Maybe you've sat in silence too." The idea comforted her more than she expected. Perhaps God was not absent in silence. Perhaps he was teaching her to listen differently. She took her Bible from the table and pressed it to her heart. "If you're not speaking, then let my heart do the hearing," she whispered. The stillness seemed to pulse, soft and alive, like a heartbeat she couldn't see, and for the first time in a long while, Helen didn't need an answer. The silence itself had become sacred, a conversation too holy for words. As December came, the days grew short and the nights long. Frost crept across the window panes, drawing silver veins in the glass. The house felt colder than ever, but Helen no longer feared it. "Winter doesn't scare me anymore," she said one morning, watching her breath fog the air. "It just reminds me that spring always comes after." Still, the loneliness returned some evenings, heavy and honest. She'd sit wrapped in her blanket, listening to the old clock's slow tick. "Everyone has gone ahead," she whispered one night, "and I'm still here." The words hung in the dim room, gentle but raw. "I suppose you have a reason for that." Her prayers were simpler now, not long lists of requests, but sighs turned upward. "Thank you for keeping me," she'd say, "even when I didn't want to be kept." Gratitude had become her defiance against despair. One evening, as snow began to fall, she lit her last candle and placed it near the window. "Someone once told me light helps travelers find their way," she said. "Maybe someone's looking for me, too." The flame flickered softly, casting gold on her frail hands. And as she watched the snow drift down outside, she felt it, the hush before revelation, the silence before presence. She smiled faintly. "Maybe you're closer in winter," she whispered, "because you know how much we need warmth." That night, Helen woke suddenly, unsure why. The house was still, the clock ticking again after weeks of silence. The fire had burned low, leaving only a dim orange glow. She listened, nothing at first, only the hush of her own heartbeat. Then, faintly, she heard it, a sound like someone breathing beside her bed, soft, gentle, familiar. Her chest tightened. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. No answer came, only the quiet rhythm of breath that wasn't her own. It wasn't frightening. It felt kind. She reached out into the darkness, her hand hovering in the air. Nothing met her touch, but warmth surrounded her, calm and unmistakable. For a long while she stayed like that, listening, feeling. The air had changed. It seemed to pulse softly, alive. "You?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is it you?" The warmth deepened, filling the room like invisible sunlight. A tear slid down her cheek. "I thought you'd forgotten me," she said. The sound didn't speak, but it lingered, breathing with her as though matching her heart's rhythm. "Then you stayed," she whispered, "even when I stopped expecting you." Her tears came freely now, but they were gentle, not desperate. The darkness no longer frightened her. It felt like a veil between her and something holy. When she finally drifted back to sleep, the sound was still there, steady and near. And though she never opened her eyes to see, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, the air in the room still felt different, warmer, lighter. Helen rose slowly, expecting to find some logical reason. A draft, the fire, the sun. But the feeling didn't fade when she moved. It followed her, quiet and kind, like someone walking just behind her. "So," she said softly, smiling, "you really stayed." She made her tea and sat at the table, her heart strangely full. Every sound, the kettle's whistle, the creak of the floorboards, the flutter of curtains, felt alive, intentional, almost musical. "Is this what it feels like when heaven visits?" she murmured, when peace stops being a word and becomes a person. All day she went about her chores, humming hymns she hadn't sung in years. The old tune, "Be Thou My Vision," filled the house like fragrance. Each note carried more than melody. It carried memory, comfort, presence. At moments, she paused mid-song, smiling as though hearing harmony not her own. By evening, the light through the window turned golden, wrapping her in a calm she couldn't explain. "If you never speak," she whispered, "this is enough." The room glowed in answer, not with brightness, but with belonging. That night, she didn't fear the dark. She left the lamp unlit and simply sat in the quiet, feeling the warmth hum around her. "So this is what you meant," she whispered. "You never left. I just stopped noticing." The second night came softer, the kind of silence that doesn't press but invites. Helen lay in bed, her hands folded over her chest, whispering prayers half asleep. Then it came, gentle, like breath over water. "Helen!" The sound was so tender she thought it was memory. But then it came again. "Helen!" Her eyes opened slowly. The air shimmered faintly, the shadows softer than before. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here." No figure stood before her, no form or light, only warmth alive and near. The voice carried neither sound nor distance. It spoke straight into her soul. "I am here too," it said. Her tears came quietly, falling onto her pillow. "You said you'd come," she murmured, and I almost stopped believing. The presence didn't rebuke, didn't explain. It only stayed. The silence after his words was rich, full of love so deep it didn't need to be spoken again. She closed her eyes, afraid to breathe, afraid the moment might vanish. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "None of us do," came the unspoken reply, felt more than heard. "But I stay anyway." And for the first time in decades, Helen slept without dreaming. Her heart had found what it had always prayed for. Not miracles, not answers, but company. The next morning, Helen woke before dawn. The candle beside her bed had gone out, but the air still glowed faintly, like memory that refused to fade. She sat up slowly, pressing her hands to her chest. The warmth was still there, quiet, alive, constant. She smiled through tears. "So it wasn't a dream," she whispered. "You really did come." She rose and opened the window. Cold air rushed in, but it didn't sting. "You're still here," she said softly. "Aren't you?" The morning breeze moved through the curtains like a sigh, brushing her face gently. It felt like a hand, unseen but unmistakable. For a long moment she stood there, eyes closed, letting that invisible touch sink into her bones. "I don't need to see you," she said. "I already know you're here." Her voice was steady now, free of the tremor of doubt. Something inside her had settled, the ache of loneliness replaced by presence too deep to name. She brewed her tea and poured 2 cups again, just as she used to. "I suppose it's not crazy anymore," she said, smiling toward the empty chair across the table. "Because you actually stayed." The silence answered her like laughter, soft and loving. As the first light touched the table, she reached for her Bible. It opened on its own to a verse she had underlined years ago. "I am with you always." Her hand trembled as she touched the words. "I believe you now," she whispered. "With all that's left of me." The days began to move differently after that. Helen still woke early, still moved through her quiet routines, but the silence no longer hurt. It had changed, no longer hollow, but full, like the pause between 2 heartbeats. "You really did stay," she said one morning as she folded her blanket. "And somehow, that's enough." She began to talk out loud again, not to fill the room, but to share it. "I'll make tea now," she'd say, or "Look at that light." The words carried no loneliness. They were conversation. Sometimes she caught herself laughing softly at memories, and the air seemed to laugh with her. "You hear me, don't you?" she asked once. The warmth that answered was all the reply she needed. The chair across from her no longer felt empty. It wasn't haunted by absence anymore. It was occupied by love unseen. She didn't imagine his face, didn't need to. Presence itself was the miracle. I used to think you visited hearts, she said quietly, but now I know. You live in them. At night, when she read her Bible by the fire, the words felt alive again. You comfort me, she read from the Psalms. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. She smiled. Even now, she said, when the world thinks I'm alone. When the last light faded from the window, she sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, for not walking past me. And though no sound replied, her soul heard the whisper, I never walk past my children. I stay. The next morning, Helen set the table again, 2 plates, 2 cups, and a vase with a single white flower. She moved carefully as if preparing for a guest, her hands steady, her face peaceful. You don't mind the chipped cup, do you? She asked, smiling. It's seen a lot of years. The air felt lighter, as though smiling back. She bowed her head before eating. Thank you, she said softly, not just for the food, but for the company. The prayer was simple, but her voice trembled at the edges. As she sipped her tea, a breeze moved through the room, though the windows were closed. It brushed against her face, soft as breath. She looked across the table where the second cup sat steaming untouched. You know, she said, for years I thought this was just a habit, setting another place. But now I see. I was saving your seat all along. Her eyes shone, not with sadness, but awe. When she finished, she left the second cup untouched. You don't need tea, she said with a gentle laugh. Just my time. The laughter echoed lightly, wrapping the room in something warmer than sunlight. That night, before she slept, she whispered, I hope you come to dinner again tomorrow. And though she never heard a reply, she felt it, that quiet stirring of peace in her chest that always meant yes. The next dawn was golden and soft, spilling over her window in wide, gentle rays. Helen opened her eyes before the birds began to sing. She didn't move right away. She just watched the light grow brighter, her heart quiet and still. Good morning, she said softly, her voice small but steady. I knew you'd be here before the sun. She rose slowly, feeling her joints ache less than usual. You make even the pain gentle, she said, smiling faintly. Everything feels lighter when you're near. She dressed, humming softly, a song her husband used to hum. Somehow, it felt like the right one. As she poured her tea, she noticed how the light touched her hands, thin, wrinkled, but glowing. It was as if heaven itself was holding them. She looked toward the chair across the table and whispered, You still sit there, don't you? The quiet air seemed to shimmer, and she smiled. Later, she opened her window and let the light flood in. It's strange, she said. Nothing in my life has changed, and yet everything has. The trees swayed gently, the breeze carrying the faint scent of spring. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her voice a whisper. Stay as long as you like. And though the light said nothing, it lingered, slow, kind, eternal. That evening, Helen sat by her window again, her Bible open, her candle burning low. The room was wrapped in gold and shadow, soft and tender. She had no questions left to ask, only gratitude left to give. I don't need to see you, she said softly. I already know what you sound like. Silence that feels like love. The flame flickered once, as if in answer. Then, softly, the air thickened with warmth again. Helen, came the whisper, quiet but close. You have waited well. Her heart trembled, but not from fear. I just didn't want you to leave, she said. The answer came, not as sound, but as stillness that wrapped her completely. I never do. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of rest. I thought you came and went, she said softly, but you were always here. The warmth deepened, surrounding her frail frame, as though the very breath of God lingered there. She felt her body grow lighter, her mind clear. You've made my loneliness holy, she whispered. You've made my silence sing. The room seemed to hum faintly, not music, but peace. And as she closed her eyes, resting in the presence, she heard one final whisper, tender as dawn itself. I don't visit hearts, Helen. I stay. The silence that once haunted her now healed her. Helen no longer feared the quiet hours. She welcomed them. They had become her chapel, her meeting place with God. She didn't fill them with noise or distraction. She simply breathed, letting stillness do what words never could. "You speak best this way," she said one afternoon, "when the world is asleep and my heart can finally listen." Her days grew slower but richer. Each moment, the sound of the kettle, the rustle of wind, the creak of wood, felt sacred. She began to notice beauty in what others overlooked. The ticking clock, long silent, began to move again one morning, and she laughed softly. "Even time wants to live again when you're near." Visitors sometimes came, neighbors, kind strangers, members of the church, and they always said the same thing. "It feels peaceful here." She would smile and nod. "He stays here," she'd reply. "That's why." They never asked who she meant. Perhaps they already knew. When evening came, she sat by her window, watching shadows lengthen gently across the walls. "You've turned my solitude into sanctuary," she said, "and for that, I'm grateful." Her words lingered in the air like a hymn. That night, as she drifted to sleep, she felt the familiar warmth settle over her once more. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full of quiet, full of love, full of him. It was spring when the knock came. Helen was sweeping her porch, humming softly when she heard it. She opened the door and froze. Her son stood there, older now, his wife beside him, and two small children clutching her skirt. For a heartbeat, she couldn't speak. "You came," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You really came." Her son stepped forward and hugged her tightly. "We should have come sooner," he whispered. "We thought you might not want the noise." She laughed softly, her eyes wet. The house has been waiting for it. She ushered them in, the smell of spring following them through the door. The children ran through the rooms giggling, filling the space with music. Helen stood in the doorway watching them, her hands pressed to her chest. "This is what heaven sounds like," she murmured. Her son turned toward her. "You've changed, Mama," he said. "You seem happy." She smiled. "I am. I found company in the quiet." They ate together at her small table, where two plates had once sat alone. The laughter and chatter filled the house, but Helen wasn't overwhelmed. She just smiled, her heart overflowing. "You're all answers to prayers I didn't even know how to pray," she said. That night when they left, her son hugged her again. "You're never alone," he said. Helen smiled knowingly. "I know," she whispered. He made sure of that. After they left, the house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel like loss. The silence felt alive, like music paused between notes. Helen sat in her chair, smiling at the still air. "You're still here," she said, "even after the laughter fades." The warmth that filled the room in answer was immediate, familiar, unshakable. She spent her days writing small notes, verses, prayers, little blessings, and leaving them in her Bible. "Someone will need them," she said softly. "Someone lonely will read them and know they're not alone." It was her way of keeping company with those who hadn't yet heard the whisper of presence. At sunset, she walked slowly through her garden, touching the blossoms as she passed. "You never really leave anything empty, do you?" she said. The breeze moved through the flowers as though nodding in agreement. Inside, she lit her candle and watched the flame dance. "You taught me that peace isn't the absence of sorrow," she said. "It's the presence of you in it." Her voice trembled, not with sadness but with gratitude. When she went to bed, the silence followed her, not behind but around, wrapping her like light. She closed her eyes, her last words a whisper, "You stayed." Years passed, but Helen remained steady, her faith woven into the very walls of her home. Her hair turned silver, her hands fragile, but her eyes shone brighter with each sunrise. She didn't fear age because she knew she was never walking toward loneliness. She was walking deeper into presence. Each morning she sat by her window, whispering blessings into the world. "Let them know you stay," she'd say. "Let someone out there feel what I felt." Her prayers were no longer requests, they were gifts. The air around her always seemed to glow, faintly, tenderly, as if responding. One night, as the candle burned low, she closed her eyes and smiled. "You never left. she whispered. "And I never will, either. Not really." The warmth that filled the room deepened, wrapping her in gentle stillness. When morning came, the sun poured through her window, touching her hands folded over her Bible. She looked peaceful, as if asleep in prayer. Her home glowed with quiet light, and those who entered felt it, a stillness too deep to name. Helen's house became a place of comfort for many who came after. They said the air there felt alive, soft, forgiving, full of love, and perhaps, somewhere in the quiet, Jesus still sat across the table, keeping his promise to stay.